I've known you
Oh,
for
it
so
was,
long, Barbara. It's such an
it was
honor.
near Scottsdale. Yeah.
Scottsdale. Scott.
International UFO Congress.
Yes. And
Yes.
we were all a bit rushed. Why didn't we keep you on a bit longer and stuff? And so this is the opportunity really to go into some very in-depth stuff that you've been talking about. Now, I got you twice at the Congress. One was the first year it was there, and of course
Yes.
you're also a member of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free organization. Is that right?
Free. Yes.
So we want to talk about that, but you've been here every year since God created the earth, Barbara. And I'm speaking from a sweltering hot 40 degrees, would you believe it, in Celsius. But normally you come here and you're not able to do that. So this is one reason I'm doing this, because really it's a way of you visiting here.
Right.
Could you tell people what you've been doing running around the crop circles, but also being one of the leading authorities on reptilian ETs? You advised Dr. Mack on that, the late Dr. Mack, John Mack, and I've got a photograph of you with John Mack, I think, is it 15, 16, 17, 8, 20 years ago? Whenever that was a long time ago, he passed away. Okay, that's enough of me waffling. Barbara Lamb, via Skype,
Hello.
from the United States, and is it California?
Yes.
It's as hotter
San
than hell
Diego.
here, and I hope it's not as hot as it is where you are, but it's amazingly hot here. But who are you? Could you tell people who you really are? Because we haven't really been able to do this in any interviews.
Well, who I am is a psychotherapist, long time now, being a psychotherapist, and also a regression therapist and hypnotherapist. And that brings us to the subject that we will be talking about, I'm sure, which is regressing people to experiences that they've had with what we call extraterrestrial beings. So that work started happening in my life in 1991. So I've done 26 years of regressing quite a number of people, about 1,800 individuals now, to their experiences with extraterrestrial beings. So many people refer to those experiences as abductions, and many people refer to those experiences as contacts. So I think it depends on whether the person really feels that they've had a positive experience in which they would call themselves a contactee and be happy and feel privileged for having those contacts, or if they feel more victimized and more negative about the whole thing, they would tend to refer to themselves as abductees. So actually, they're one and the same. In other words, they're all what John Mack and I have been calling experiencers of anomalous contacts and experiencers of extraterrestrial experiences. So people sometimes ask me, what are the aliens like? What are the extraterrestrials like? And I say, well, there's no one answer to that, because there seem to be so many entirely different kinds of beings who come from all kinds of locations in the cosmos. And some of these beings, as far as we can tell, actually come into our third dimension for a brief period of time from another dimension, another frequency of reality. Now, of course, we're very accustomed here in the world, on Earth, to scientific investigation. And indeed, that's extremely important. But for most of history, up until very, very recently, scientific investigation seemed to be focusing on the physical world, the material world, third dimensional world, which is a much more dense and slower vibration than we've been learning about many of the other dimensions. So now, fortunately, some of the physicists, the really top physicists in our world now, are talking about they are discovering that there are a number of different dimensions of reality. And that means that each dimension is sort of lighter, more refined, faster in frequency than our third dimensional reality. And I've been very pleased that even some physicists have mentioned in the last 2 or 3 years that I've been aware of that there are as many as 33 different dimensions, different frequencies in what we consider reality. So that's way beyond what most of us have been focused on.
But I mean, Barbara, if you look at a keyboard on a piano, you can get an awful lot of stuff on a piano.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Barbara, it's this idea of 3D, 3 dimensions, and then 33 dimensions, and I made a reference to like a piano. It's like octaves on a piano. So is it something
yes.
like that? Like you play a tune and you've got lower octaves and higher octaves and things like that?
Well, that's a very interesting analogy. I had never thought of it that way, but I think there's some accuracy to that. And I think that we people on Earth do sometimes get a sense of different realities or different dimensions. For instance, those of us who have had some out-of-body experiences have realized that for those experiences, we've not been in our physical bodies, but we've necessarily been totally conscious and very, very aware and very alert. And I think in those instances, with the out-of-body experiences, we are actually in a different dimension without our physical bodies. So that's wonderful. I think for those of us who've had the wonderful privilege of experiencing that, because we've known that there are other realities. We've actually experienced it. And some people, I believe, experience that state of being, that other dimensionality, when they are deeply in meditation and when they are not aware of being in their physical body, but they're aware of other things, of what their mind and other kinds of senses are aware of. That is, other than physical senses.
Now, this is a big difference in the established order of ufology. That is, you're not talking 3D or outer space here. You're talking a dimensional aspect, a completely different level of consciousness.
Definitely, yes. And this is important, I think, in the field of ufology, because many, many people experience that they're in a place and they don't see anybody else there, and then suddenly there's a being there without having seen the being come in through a window or through a door, and suddenly the being is there as if poofed right there, and then whatever is happening goes ahead and occurs, and then suddenly poofed, the being is not there anymore. That happened to me several years ago, and so I have a sense of knowing what I'm talking about there, that suddenly in an empty living room there was nobody there, and then suddenly within half a second there was a whole being standing right there, and we interacted together for a few minutes at least, and then poofed, suddenly that being was gone without having seen him walk toward the front door and open it and go out, or even without seeing him vanish through a wall. So I think what happens in situations like that is that the beings pop into our three-dimensional reality, and then when they're through doing whatever they have come to do, they just enter right out of our reality, out of our third dimension. It seems to be very, very easy for them from what we can tell. I don't believe that we do that, although maybe.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Barbara. I've had several experiences with that. It's as if you suddenly
Yeah.
become out of focus in this domain and you're just no longer a focused image. So I suggest that humans do have that ability, and maybe it's been restricted from us, but that's another kettle of fish. So,
Well, there's another aspect I'd like to mention that's sort of corollary to this, and that is that certain people, whom we call experiencers of extraterrestrial contact, certain ones of them, on occasion, experience invisibility. In other words, they're perfectly physical. They're here in this reality physically in their bodies. And then suddenly they realize that nobody can see them. So I had a few years of wonderful experiences with a man who lived here in California. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he had so many ET experiences, and he told about a time when he went out into the California desert to a particular place called Joshua Tree National Monument.
yeah, Giant
Many
Rock,
people know
fantastic
that
up
place.
there. Really, is it Big Rock
Yeah,
or Giant Rock? Up, wonderful
absolutely.
place.
Oh, yeah. So he was in the Joshua Tree. Well, it's like a national park, really. And he went to a campground. He drove his big van, and in the middle of the day, went into a campground to set up his little camping space. He was going to stay there for the weekend. And there were people sitting around in lawn chairs and around a barbecue right next to where he was. And he went right over to them and said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And nobody registered, nobody seemed to hear him. And he went right into the middle of the circle of these chairs so they'd be sure to see him. He just wanted to be friendly, get to know who his neighbors were going to be for the weekend. And they didn't hear him and they didn't see him. He couldn't understand that, of course. So he went to the next group of people who were at the campground and went over and said, "Hi, how are you doing?" Which was very typical of this particular man. And nobody heard him, nobody turned around. He went where they could see him very clearly in front of them, said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And even sort of thumped on one of the vehicles to make a nice loud metallic sound to get their attention. Nobody heard that, and nobody saw him, and so on around the campground. Finally, he had to consider that he must have somehow turned invisible. Later on that day, a few hours later, when he had been out and around the camp, the Joshua Tree area, he came back to the campground, and people did see him. And he said, "Didn't you hear me earlier? Didn't you see me? I was standing right in front of you making a noise on your vehicle." No, they hadn't. So that was one case that I knew of personally, and I've heard of other cases. They've been relayed to me by experiencers. For instance, there was one experiencer, a woman, who went to the post office to mail a package or something, and she was standing at the post office counter relating to the person who was serving her, and somebody else came up and squashed her into the counter because that second person didn't see her standing right there. So I know a few people who happen to be experiencers to whom that sort of thing has happened. And fortunately, it does seem to be temporary, and they do not seem to recognize what it was that brought on that particular state, that temporary state of invisibility.
Have
And
you?
this,
Sorry, have you heard of the College of Psychic Studies in London?
I have, and in fact, I visited the College of Psychic Studies in London back in 1986.
Wow. Well, there's a lady there called Sue Allen who did a lot of psychic protection courses and all sorts of things, and she was the first psychic or psychologist therapist, and she has dealt with greys, which amazed me. But nobody else in the room even knew what they were. But she's dealt with greys in terms of a sort of a haunted house syndrome. But one of the
All
things
right.
she did explain was the ability to make yourself invisible by simply not somehow psychically you just make other people not see you.
Well, I think that in that case, it's a deliberate thing
Oh
that
yeah.
somebody would decide. I think it would be very interesting to know how to do that. I don't know how to do that, but I myself had an experience, back in about 1979 or 1980, and I was at a conference, a big conference of dance therapists, and we had been doing movement workshops all morning. And one of them really got me into a very altered state of consciousness. And after that workshop, we all gathered in a major hallway to go into the banquet room for a noontime banquet. And in that hallway, I experienced that I was invisible. And I would go up to one little group of people, or maybe two people, even people I knew, and started to talk to them. They absolutely did not see me. They did not know I was there. So I spent about 45 minutes in that hallway. The banquet was delayed for some reason. And I went from one little group to another, and throughout that whole time, nobody saw me. Well, I was very uncomfortable with that for quite a while.
Sorry,
And
was that because was the meal delayed because maybe you were in a different reality and the meal actually wasn't delayed? It's just that while you were there, you were in a different time bubble of some kind.
oh, that's a wonderful question. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that's a possibility. What I did conclude, and it may be accurate or not, was that because of the movement and the very deep relaxation I had been in that morning, especially later in the morning, that I was in such an altered state of consciousness myself that somehow that affected my physical body. I'll probably never really know the answer to that.
I mean, but could you have, for instance, have been out of body, not realizing it, and your body was maybe back in another room somewhere, and you just didn't realize you left it? No.
Well, that's a possibility. And I've had enough out of body experiences on other occasions to know that it seems like I am physically moving. In that case, I was standing and walking and trying to touch the arm of some of those people I wanted to talk with, and they didn't feel anything. So, yeah, it's just one of those mysteries, but it may be more common than we think of, for all we know. I think we humans are capable of many, many different states of being, certainly different states of consciousness, and then probably different physical states of being. And one of the things that's very exciting about this time in history is that a lot of this is opening up, and we're getting to explore this and have the freedom, at least in this part of the world, the Western world, freedom to openly talk about these things like we're doing right now. And to me, that is a wonderful thing.
Well, we mentioned John Mack earlier, and I met him, and I got the phone call, and I know Veronica Ford Keane, who she had to identify him in North London, but he was one of the biggest single pioneers. He really stuck his neck out on the line and took a
Oh,
lot
he
of.
did.
But you were helping him. Could you? I mean, in terms of bringing this subject to the public domain on mainstream, that was a key, step forward. Could you just tell us all about that?
First of all, in the early 1990s, John Mack over there at Harvard was doing this wonderful work with experiencers and finding out through regression that many of them had had very detailed experiences with these extraterrestrial beings. So he was already working on that and had quite a number of people he was working with, and even had a support group for some of these experiencers. Now, parallel to that, in the meantime, out on the west coast of the US in California, I was getting into this work without having heard of him, and he had not heard of me. So, very independently, on both of these coasts of the US, we were both doing a lot of pioneering work in meeting with people and regressing them to the details of their extraterrestrial encounters. Then it was in about 1993 that I was speaking at a conference in Wyoming, and that was called the Rocky Mountain Conference on UFO Investigation, a wonderful conference put on by excellent Leo Sprinkle. And I was speaking at that conference, and John Mack was speaking at the conference. I had not really been particularly aware of him, certainly didn't know what he looked like, but when I was giving a lecture about one woman whom I regressed many times to many extraterrestrial experiences, and I was talking about how we discovered in our work that her son, who was about age 3 at the time, that he was having these encounters as well. And her little niece, who was about 2.5, was having the experiences. And gradually, as we continued working together, her husband had been having ET experiences all of his life since early childhood. Well, I was telling about this, and the woman whom I was talking about, that client, had come to that conference, and she was in the front row smiling and grinning and nodding and wiping tears from her eyes. She was so moved to hear this material about her life without her name being used, but having it discussed to a really very fine audience. And in the back row, there was this man who was grinning and nodding with almost everything I said and just sort of beaming out. And after the lecture, that man came up to me, and I realized it was Dr. John Mack. So that was a really wonderful beginning. And then we met at quite a number of other conferences.
Sorry, Barbara, that's a heck of a thing to say. I mean, without that simple description, that he'd gone into the depth of the subject from a completely intellectual and totally different point of view, but was coming up with the same conclusions. That's very important, Barbara.
Oh, yes. So we were very, very pleased to meet each other and begin talking about this. We also went for a few summers to a special gathering of UFO-minded people in Newport, Rhode Island, and we would meet there and discuss things further. We had more hours to really sit and talk about it. And he mentioned at one of those gatherings that he was extremely interested in finding out more about the reptilian beings. And I said, well, that's really interesting, because I've had a number of regressions with these other people where they had very important experiences with reptilian beings. So he wanted to know what I knew about them. And make a long story short, he invited me to do two things. One was to give to him any transcripts, any material that I had from those regressions to people's extraterrestrial, reptilian, particularly reptilian encounters. And then we would collaborate and write a book on that. Well, unfortunately, that book never did get written by either of us, but he also had been invited to give a lecture on reptilians about 7 months later from our discussion at the International UFO Congress, and he asked me to be part of that lecture. In other words, lecture right there on the stage with him about what I knew about reptilians. So we were definitely planning to do that and had been invited to do that. And then about 2 months later from this decision and agreement to do it, John Mack was struck by a drunk driver in London and instantly killed.
Now, this is where Veronica Ford Keane comes in. She identified the body. I think he was staying with her at the time.
With Veronica, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he was. Now, there's another very interesting part of this, which I really treasure. You might or might not really be interested in this, but
tell us more. This
after
is marvelous.
he died, about 3 or 4 weeks later, it just happened that I was having a difficult time trying to sleep in a house where there were cats, which I'm highly allergic to. And I was having what it would be similar to an asthmatic attack, and had to go out and sleep on the person's patio because I could just hardly breathe, really struggling for breath. And while I was propped up in a patio chair and trying so hard to ease my breathing, breathe out whatever I'd taken in from the cats and come back to normal. And during that process, still struggling to breathe, I felt a warm presence right near me, and I heard in my mind very clearly, distinctly heard, in other words, telepathically, I heard the voice of John Mack, who was right there, maybe about 3 feet away from me, it seemed, according to the feeling of presence. And he simply said, "You're going to be all right, Barbara. You're going to get through this." And that was so reassuring that I could relax even more and regain a little bit faster my normal breathing. So that meant that John Mack paid me a visit from the spiritual dimension that he was residing in after having physically died. Then, about 3 weeks after that, this is all in the fall of 2004, I was talking with a new client who had come for regular counseling work. And after our session was over, she sort of patted to the sofa cushion next to her where she was sitting and said, "I don't know how you feel about this, but there's someone here who wants to talk to you. It's a man." And I was familiar with that sort of thing and very positively feeling about it. So I said, "Oh yes, that's fine." And so through her mouth, for about 45 minutes, she transmitted messages from John Mack. And we had a conversation because somehow through her, he could hear my out loud verbal words and my questions and my comments. So we really had a conversation. And not only was it auditory, but I could feel that same sense of presence, that he seemed to be in the room, even though he wasn't. He was wherever it is that people are in the other dimension after physically dying. So during that long conversation, so many things happened that I will never forget. One of them, when I asked, "What is it like for you now?" I didn't want to say, "What is it like in heaven?" or, put a name to it. So I just said, "What is it like for you now?" And he paused for a second and said, "Oh, there's so much going on." And I was imagining gathering together with all the other spirits of his colleagues and family members and dear friends who had previously died. And they were there having reunions. And he was experiencing many things. And I said, "What about those beings that we've been calling extraterrestrials? Do you ever have a chance to get together with the souls of those beings?" And he said, "Yes, anybody can do that if they want to. But if they don't think about that, they probably wouldn't be aware of it. But of course, I think about it. I'm aware of it." So he said he has been in contact with the souls of extraterrestrials. And then he paused and said, "But it's not exactly the way that we thought it was." And I unfortunately don't know more about what he meant about that. But that has been a thought that I've been wondering about ever since that experience in
I mean,
2004.
would he have been allowed to tell us?
Would he be allowed? What was that?
Yeah, would he have been allowed to tell us? Or you're not allowed to say, or?
Would he have been allowed to tell us? That is a very interesting question. I think so, but that's just an impression. It seemed like he was free to say anything that was truthful, anything that he was experiencing.
Well, Barbara, I've got my own little experience with John Mack. I mean, for some reason, at Glastonbury Symposium, when I asked him to sign my book. He sort of looked at me and aghast. "Oh, you mean you want an author to sign their book for you?" Sarcastically. But I don't know. I remember being in a crop circle with you and John, and I had
Yes.
I had my video cameras there, and we were having such a wonderful experience there with you and with Valia and John and I took a couple of still pictures, and I had that video camera, and I could have just said, "Hi, John, let's do an interview in a crop circle and everything else," and I just felt it was right to give him his peace. Just the man's on a day off, just
Yes.
leave him alone. And I
holiday.
have to say I had the same with Bob Lazar recently, but last year. But I was going for a job in Manchester in the new BBC complex there in Salford, and in the tram just before I went there, John Mack appeared. He just sort of sat there,
Oh.
and this was a really important job interview, and I just sort of had that experience, and it was something which I wasn't going to be there. And there's a lot of reasons why I would say that, but anyway, it's just amazing when that kind of thing happens. But you've talked about reptilians, you've specified that. What's the big deal about these reptilians? What's so important? Why not other beings or whatever? Why did he focus on reptilians, and why do you focus on reptilians?
Well, I think that the reptilians are not necessarily more important than other species of extraterrestrials, but his feeling at the time in the early and mid 2000s was that the reptilians were being very misunderstood. There were certain public figures, one notable one, who was speaking in very negative terms about reptilian beings and how they're influencing some of our political leaders. They might even be some of our political leaders. And anyway, it seemed to him and to me that it was a very one-sided picture that was given to the public about reptilians. And I knew from my work with experiencers that they had many, many different types of reptilians. They were not all the same, and that maybe they were being quite misunderstood in many cases. And so he felt in 2003 and 2004, when we were talking about doing this work together, he felt very strongly that the whole subject of reptilian extraterrestrials needed to be brought out more to the public. And I was very happy to do that too, because, I thought all the types that I had become aware of were absolutely fascinating, and reptilian certainly with them, and was aware that they had a very bad press, shall we say, up till that time. So we were very happy to share with each other what we knew from the work that we had done, and we're happy to go forward with that project. Now, I'd like to say another thing about him and the reptilians and planning to do that lecture, which he never did get to do because of having been killed. So about 6 weeks after he had died, and I've already mentioned that I had a particular counseling client who happened to be a medium and brought him through for a long conversation. And during that conversation, which I've already just talked about a couple of minutes ago, I asked, first of all, I asked, would you like myself and Joe Lewis, who'd been brought in to speak about that subject also at the UFO Congress, would you like us to present the material that you would have presented? And I knew that he already had an outline of what he was intending to present. And so I said, how would I know what you wanted to say? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, I have notes in a big manila envelope, and it's in the office.
We just had a glitch there. Could you just say that sentence again? Something happened there.
Okay. He said, well, that's easy for you to find out what I would want to say in that lecture, because I have notes, many notes about my thoughts that I was going to present. And those thoughts are all written on papers in a big manila envelope in my office. He said, I have 3 offices, but I'm referring to the office in my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he said, in my home, I have a little alcove office between the dining room and the kitchen, and a little old wooden desk and little old wooden bookshelves. And in the middle of the bookshelf that's right next to my desk, the middle shelf, there's a manila envelope still sticking out a little bit. And in that manila envelope are all my notes for what I was planning to say at the UFO Congress. Well, fortunately, I knew the young woman who lived on the 3rd floor of his house. And he said, just call her. Her first name was Karen. Call Karen and she'll go down and find the notes and send them to you, and then you'll know what I was going to say in that lecture. So I called Karen. She found the notes. She sent them. And he told me in that same conversation through the medium client, he told me about all the different kinds of papers and computer printouts and legal note page papers with quick sentences written diagonally going across the page. And I made quick notes about that as I was listening to all of this in this medium session. And then when the packet of papers arrived in the mail, I compared it. He had given me information about every page of information and drawings of reptilians, everything that he would have presented in his lecture. Now, to me, that was really a blessing, an incredible thing that somebody who had died and was living as a very conscious spirit in the spirit dimension could find a way to give that detailed information to somebody still living here who really wanted that information. So indeed,
Wow.
that information
That
was
is phenomenal, but it's also proof after life of death, and which Dr. Rowney Kilder, late Dr. Rowney Kilder, mentioned, and things like that. But also
Yeah.
the reptilian story. When we did a thing here in the UK called the Amash Project with my dear colleague Joanne Summerscales, we did have a number of reptilian witnesses there, and they explained that this reptilian thing, they have got a bad press. And there are good guys and bad guys, and just because one's a reptilian doesn't make you a bad person.
That's right.
So,
Yes.
I mean, it's very important to sort of just take a civilized, wider view on this, and I think it's very creditable that you mentioned this along with John.
Oh, yes. And some of the reptilians we know from people's experiences are very, very interested in having sexual relationships with human beings, both males and female human beings.
Now, just sorry to interrupt on that. Now, this is something which a lot of people say somebody's half reptilian or 40% or 50% or the bloodlines. I mean, is this an energetic union on a soul level? Because it couldn't be biological on a genetic level, could it? I mean, how does that actually work?
It seems like it could not work on a biological level because reptilian life is quite different from our mammalian life. However, I have worked with so many people who have had reptilian hybrid children. And in most cases, of course, those hybrid children are not human enough in proportion to live here successfully on Earth. So my experience, your clients who have reptilian hybrid human children, they see them only when they're on the ships, the UFOs. And it has been said by several of the adult reptilians when my experiences have met them on the UFOs, it's been said to my clients that the reptilians are highly grateful to these humans and that they enormously prize these hybrid children. In one case, a woman I regressed who had had many different types of extraterrestrial experiences. On this one particular case, we went to a reptilian experience, and she realized that there was a big man type figure standing next to her, and she reached up and grabbed at his face because she sensed that there was a human mask. And after she pulled off the mask, she realized it was a pure reptilian face. And he said, "I am your reptilian husband." And then they brought in a young boy whom she guessed would be about 3.5 to 4 years old. And she got off the table that she had been sitting on and knelt down and embraced this little boy who was half reptilian and half her child. And Then the adult reptilian said, "You have no idea how much we treasure and prize this boy, the reptilian hybrid boy." And he said, "We know that you humans think that these reptilian hybrid children are monsters or, very disagreeable, but to us they are highly prized, and we are very proud of him and the other ones too." So, when you hear this in a regression, it really adds another aspect to the whole reptilian thing, that to them, this is a very special, precious, highly prized thing that they can create reptilian hybrid children with human beings.
Now, something we did do with the Amash for the very, very first time was that we introduced a gentleman, English gentleman called Simon Parks. He's been saying a lot like that. In fact, the late Max Spears explained his connection with the reptilian, 50% and things like that. What do you feel about that? I mean, Simon's very prominent now in this and talking about the reptilian side of things. Are you aware of that?
I've been aware of Simon Parks, and particularly through my work with the ET human hybrids who are living here on Earth, but I have not actually caught up with any written material or recorded material. But interestingly, just 2 nights ago, in looking for something else, I ran across a YouTube video of him, and I ran out of time, but I am intending to go back and listen to that now.
Yeah, well, there's four of those that we did with Joanne, my former colleague at Amash, and the third one, a gentleman called Win Keach, who you probably know from the crop circles.
Oh, yes.
Win is a colleague. Well, they live very close together, way up in North Yorkshire. But something that they were playing with is that each other was actually accessing the other person's mind. Simon would get inside Win's, and Win would get inside Simon's in the ability of the ability of the being to take control or get in there. But they joked about having a firewall and fighting each other people off. And the person in that interview, Joanne, actually tried accessing Simon's, and not with permission. But there's a little bit of a story there. But it seems that, wherever you go, there is this message of connection with these beings.
Yes, we may be much more connected than we have any idea. Now, one of the interesting little side notes going on in my current life right now, and really has nothing to do with reptilian extraterrestrials, but it reminds me of that in the sense that my granddaughter, a teenager, has 2 little pets. And these little pets are geckos. So the geckos live in a glass terrarium with a heating light shining down into it. And she will pick up one of the little geckos. They're very small. They're only just a few inches long. And they seem very tender, like very tender skin. And they seem very sweet and cute. I mean, I am so thrilled that I have the experience of getting to know a gecko. And
is that because it's like a child? It's got coherence. You're getting a consciousness there, connection.
Yes. And so what I keep seeing with my granddaughter is that she'll pick up the little gecko and stroke it and talk to it, and they have an actual affectionate relationship, and it will reach around. If she holds her hand up to her face, it will kiss her cheek, well, like a little lick, which she considers a kiss. And so she had this little gecko for several months, and just recently another friend who had a gecko wanted to get a new home for the gecko, so my granddaughter took in this new one. And we assumed, as we so erroneously often do in our assumptions, we assumed that the two might fight or take opposite ends of the terrarium, but they didn't. These little reptile creatures, little geckos, immediately took right to each other and basically, in as close as they could do it, a hug, an approximation we would consider a hug. And they nestle together, they sleep together, they like to be right up against each other's sides. And it's been a very peaceful friendship. Now, I am absolutely amazed. So, anyway, it brings my attention to the fact that some reptiles, even though a lot of them, as soon as they're hatched or born, or however they actually come fully into this existence, they leave the mother. They don't have mothering. That's why I was so surprised that these two little adult geckos, in coming together immediately and still, 2 or 3 weeks later, still have what we would consider an affectionate relationship together. Now, that may seem like a totally ungermane item, but I think it is germane to the whole subject of reptiles on Earth, and even the larger picture maybe of reptilian beings. So if these little gecko reptiles on Earth can have a lastingly affectionate, happy, it seems, relationship, then it seems to me that could be very possible for those reptilians out there, that they have families, they have their form of love. Maybe it comes more in the terms of pride and gratitude. Who knows? Those were some of the words. They say blessed, gratitude, pride. But still, that means relationship, and it means feeling that we as humans can even relate to.
Do you want to take a quick water break? We're almost up to the hour, and I want to come back with you concentrating on those hybrids. That is something that you did want to mention, you want to talk about, the hybrid children.
Yes.
Okay, so this is Barbara Lamb. We're extending the interview from the UFO Congress, and I'm in Devizes in England on Hotter as Hell, and you're in California.
Right, San Diego.
San Diego, and a lovely place. I've been there. So just for a couple of seconds, we'll just take a short break.